Welcome to the first part of our traditional introduction to philosophy. If you remember, we will be looking at metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics in that order. In this audio prezi, we will cover some definitions of metaphysics. Of course, there's more than one definition. Some quick examples of early versions of metaphysics, especially that of Pythagoras, since he would heavily influence Plato. Then we will look at one of the most famous philosophers, Plato, and his thought experiment about the cave. Finally, we will have a brief example of contemporary metaphysics, and then we will end by asking, why does all this even matter? As you will learn by the end of this class, if not sooner, philosophy is as complex and difficult as any other college subject. It is also probably the longest-running study still taught in colleges and universities. Metaphysics has been done for literally thousands of years. Thousands. Not hundreds, thousands. The earliest thinkers most likely thought of metaphysics as first philosophy, or first science. In other words, it described what came first, what one had to get clear before anything else could be set on a firm intellectual foundation. There is some evidence that ethics, politics, and other studies were only considered reliable if the first philosophy, if the metaphysics, was already set out. The actual word metaphysics was not even coined until 100 or so years after the death of Plato's student Aristotle. If you look the word up in a text or online, the most common definitions will look something like, quote, a study of the fundamental reality of our world, end quote. These definitions will often mention equally vague words like reality or being, making the definition less instead of more clear. And since this is philosophy, it should come as no surprise that there is also a long-standing critique of the very idea of actually doing metaphysics. Philosophers have cautioned, warned, and derided the very idea of a first philosophy or metaphysics. Kant thought it was a dark ocean strewn with philosophic wrecks. Bradley believed metaphysics was just used to justify our ideas we already had. The philosophy student turned director and actor, Woody Allen, joked that he was thrown out of college for cheating on his metaphysics exam by looking into the soul of the kid sitting next to him. In our general introduction to philosophy, I suggested that one way to define metaphysics was to look beyond these many vague textbook definitions, to ignore what they say, and instead look at what they actually do. Over the past 2,000 years or so, philosophers have asked and answered certain types of questions when they were doing metaphysics. In the introductory prezi, I separated them into older, more general questions and newer, more specific questions. Now, of course, these two categories are not perfect, but they are close enough for our purposes here. The older questions asked about the fundamental aspects of the world. What does it even mean to be, capital B, capital E, a thing? What things or properties are universal? What is time? What changes? And what is permanent? Now, some contemporary philosophers, of course, still do this old-style metaphysics. But many do a newer version of metaphysics that focuses on more specific questions. For example, what is identity? What is consciousness? And what is the relationship between scientific discoveries and metaphysics? Personally, I prefer this more pragmatic definition of metaphysics. Metaphysics is what metaphysicians actually do. The very questions they ask define metaphysics. Early metaphysics was a fascinating and unusual mixture of assertions about the ultimate nature of the world. The pre-Socratics, what that means is that they came before the philosopher Socrates, are often presented as the first people to think causally about the universe. Instead of blindly following their culture or blindly following their religious leaders, they tried to give physical, not spiritual, reasons for the existence of the world around them. Now, this may be more tale than fact, but there is some sense to the tale. Around 600 BCE, that's before the Common Era, Thales, the first metaphysician, argued that everything, when you get right down to it, is simply made of water. That was his metaphysical idea. Another philosopher, Democritus, thought that the fundamental stuff was most likely atoms. Yes, you heard correct. He guessed that everything was made up of atoms, indivisible stuff. That's what he thought an atom was. Now, this was a pretty good guess for 400 BCE. But some of the assertions from these early metaphysicians were a bit more abstract than water or atoms. For example, Heraclitus thought that everything is actually an ever-changing flux. He famously said, "You can never step in the same river twice." This, of course, is because it is always changing, it's always in flux. While Parmenides was the exact opposite of Heraclitus. He thought change was mere illusion. Nothing really changes, we just think it does. Our final early example of metaphysics comes from Pythagoras. If that name sounds a little familiar to you, it means you actually paid attention in math class. Pythagoras is credited with creating the Pythagorean theorem, which helps explain the relationship between the sides of a right triangle. But for our purposes here, he is more important for arguing that all things are number. He seemed to mean by this interesting statement that the underlying relationships and underlying reality of the world is mathematical. The world we live in, that we see around us, is messy, it's chaotic, and it's contingent, meaning it's full of chance. But the world of number is perfectly organized. This is important because Pythagoras would greatly influence Plato, especially with the idea that this world of number is so perfect that it is literally more real than the world we actually live in. More perfect equated for Pythagoras with more real. Now it's time for a bit of a philosophy break, where we can see some high-quality philosophical reasoning. Of course, I'm just joking. Now, Plato is the philosopher we will be discussing in the next couple sections. But Socrates is the real hero of the story we will be telling. Plato was the student of Socrates. But Socrates never actually wrote anything down, so all we have to go on are Plato's dialogues. That is what we call his collection of philosophical essays. To say these dialogues is important is simply an understatement. Nearly every educated person for the last 1,000 years have studied some Plato. Now you are part of this long tradition as well. Plato himself lived from 427 BCE to 347 BCE. Socrates died a bit earlier in 399 BCE. You can see Socrates' death in this famous painting in front of you by Jacques-Louis David. If you cannot tell, he is getting ready to drink a poison made from the root of a hemlock plant. He is in this situation because he was found guilty by a jury of 500 Athenian citizens, his city, of impiety and corrupting the youth, both of which he did in some fashion by his own admission. Now we are focusing here on the metaphysics of Plato, but if you are interested in this very gripping story of Socrates and his trial, you can read Plato's dialogues, especially the dialogue called the Apology and the dialogue called the Phaedo. In fact, the Apology is in our class reader. But for metaphysics, the Phaedo is most important because it is where we can see the link between Pythagoras and Plato. On his very deathbed, literally his deathbed, Socrates is still doing philosophy, just like I plan to do. And in his deathbed discussion, he stresses that it is impossible, literally impossible, to find truth in this life, because we are tied to the imperfections, weaknesses, and failings of our own bodies. This degenerate body, says Socrates, cannot lead us to truth, because our senses are just as imperfect as the rest of our body. Now remember that Pythagoras said that number, yes, perfect number, is actually more real than the world we live in. Socrates takes this idea of perfection, not necessarily about number, but about perfection, and runs with it. In fact, it becomes the basis of his own metaphysics. Plato gives us his metaphysics in the words of Socrates in several places in his dialogues, but the two most famous examples show up in his most famous dialogue, called The Republic. The Republic is really a book about justice. It ranges from speaking about justice as a character trait for an individual to speaking about justice for an entire city-state, Athens, or some other city-state in ancient Greece. To do this, Plato proposes a system of government with philosopher kings at the head. Now, there is a lot of other stuff in this amazing book, and some of it will return when we look at politics later in the semester. But remember, here we're focusing on metaphysics. In the Republic, Plato gives two very different examples to explain his metaphysics. The first is the divided line, and the second is Plato's cave. But obviously, a cave is way cooler than a divided line, so we'll be looking at the cave. Now this section is a bit long, so get ready to do some metaphysics. I want you to imagine that you are that person you see chained to the wall in the image. From childhood, adulthood to death, you and the people next to you are chained to the wall watching shadows flicker by. You have been there so long that you do not even question the reality of those shadows. They simply are reality to you. Now imagine in a freak accident you somehow get free and turn around, and the brightest light you have ever seen stands behind the wall you were chained to. You look back and forth and begin to realize that the shadows of horses and people you once took for reality are in fact just shadows from a fire. After calming your nerves, you begin to notice another light behind the fire, and you follow it, and it leads outside. Now the pain is searing. Minutes ago you thought the fire was bright. Now you see that the fire was nothing but a pale copy of the power and presence of the actual sun. The shadows you once took to be your everything were really just copies of copies of copies. A real living horse was copied and brought down into the cave, and the shadow of that copy was cast onto the wall. And you and the people next to you took this weak copy of a copy to be reality. How wrong were you? If you can understand the story I just gave you, you can understand Plato's metaphysics. But here's the trick to really, really getting it. While you sit here listening and watching, you are actually in the cave. Right now in front of your computer, you are tied up in that cave. And you do not even know it. Plato believed that the world around us, the world of the body and the world of the senses, can never give you access to reality or truth. At best, our senses can give us a pale copy of a higher, more perfect reality. Now, if we try to use only reason, not the senses, we can sometimes rise up from the vague sensory opinions. Reason of the purest sort, like that found in mathematics or geometry, can lead in the proper direction. If you can hear echoes of Pythagoras here, you're actually getting it. And in the highest levels of this pursuit, the perfect form can be found. The objects walking around on Earth that we call horses have their source in the forms that occupy the pure intellectual heaven of Plato. The shadow on the wall was a copy of a copy of a copy of the actual pure intellectual form of horseness. This ideal form is perfect because it is ideal, not imperfect like an actual living, breathing horse, which has imperfections built into it because it's living. This same reasoning applies to everything. Everything you are seeing around you in your life right now. Everything you have thought about courage, cowardice, justice, or injustice are also just copies of an ideal form of justice. And here's an interesting point. We never really have access to the final form in this life. All of these forms, horseness, computerness, courage, and justice, are all just themselves a pale copy of the absolute form of the good. G-O-O-D with a capital G. Now, if all that seemed like a very, very abstract idea, welcome to the world of metaphysics. That is simply how metaphysics works. It is like the word problem to end all word problems. It is trying to describe the very finest grained and fundamental aspects of our world in words. It can be very tiring for the brain at first. So, let's finish up by looking at a short example of contemporary metaphysics. Our example will be what is consciousness. And notice the is. That's one of the clues that you know you're doing metaphysics. Now, it might seem obvious to you that you are conscious. I hope you're conscious, at least. But philosophers have been arguing about consciousness in one form or another for thousands of years. Yes, I know, philosophers are now arguing about something else for 1,000 years. But in recent years, scientists, psychologists, and neuroscientists have started to get into these debates as well. The history of this is very interesting, if you're a geek like me. But to summarize, let me just say that quite a bit of it comes down to two main positions: dualism and materialism. Now, dualists believe that there is a split between mind, which is a non-material or non-physical thing, and body, which is solid and mechanical. Now, this dualist view has a long relationship with religious ideas of the soul being separate from the body. Now, some modern philosophers have dropped the religious aspect, but kept the non-physical description of the mind. The second version of consciousness metaphysics is called materialism. Now, this means that everything, including consciousness, is just physical processes. And this is the version we will quickly examine, and you will begin to see the problem with the metaphysics of consciousness. So right now, if you push the arrow, it will add some additional features to the slide, and you will start to see what bothers a materialist philosopher of consciousness. In our everyday lives, we have this idea of consciousness floating around in our heads. This consciousness seems separate from the body, and it seems to have nearly magical properties like free will. Unlike everything else in the universe, we feel like our minds are separate and free of physical entanglements. And here is what the materialist wonders. Subatomic particles have no consciousness. Atoms have no consciousness. DNA has no consciousness. And as far as we can tell from the outside, neurons do not have consciousness either. More importantly, none of these processes are immaterial or non-physical. In fact, they are all perfect examples of physical processes. Now, we might not fully understand every aspect of these processes yet, but there's no reason to think we are missing half the story. And this leads the materialist to argue that dualists are simply mistaken. Mind is not separate. Mind is not non-physical. In fact, mind is really just brain. Mind equals brain, and nothing else. So, you can make up your own mind as to who is correct. But this is an example of contemporary metaphysics of consciousness, greatly simplified, of course. Now, if you would like to learn a little bit more, just search for some of my favorites on this topic. David Chalmers, the OG of the group, Dan Dennett, or Owen Flanagan. Now, there are many others, but I find these three to be very interesting and fun to read, especially Dennett. Now, all of this matters for a few reasons. Believe it or not, some people just think it is fun to think the biggest or think the smallest possible thoughts. I know I certainly do. Metaphysics is also becoming increasingly mixed in with science. Some philosophers, like me, welcome the advances of science into traditionally philosophical or theological areas. But many, and I mean many, other philosophers bristle and fight against the unwelcome intrusion of science into their pet theories. And this tension makes metaphysics a perennial and interesting issue. And finally, we saw that metaphysics can even tell us something about our most basic views of the world. Even our consciousness is not immune from the metaphysics of philosophers.